I am not a world-leading expert. I have not achieved global acclaim. I've no great idea, let alone an innovative invention. But what I am is a student, which basically means that I learn. That's my job description, and it has been since I was 4 years old. So that's almost 18 years that I have existed as part of a community of learners, and I really quite like learning. When I discover a new fact, when I figure something out or create a connection between 2 points, it satisfies somewhere deep within my little head, because you see, I am driven by some sort of obsessive, incessant, and probably unhealthy need to know and to question everything. I mean everything. But there's a problem, quite a big one, in fact, huge. You see, the more time I spend studying, the more I realize just how many conflicting viewpoints there are. There is an impossibly unfathomable number of things that can be known, and with so many of them, there is no definitive right or wrong. And with so much to know and so many ways to think about what we know, we argue round and round and round in circles over so many things: politics, science, religion, healthcare, cheese, music tastes, the right directions to take. Everything, big or small, we argue. And these arguments divide us up into communities based on what we know and what we believe. So, for example, people who believe in the existence of ghosts are a community. People who believe that odd socks are superior to matching socks are another community. And for a more topical example, people who believe we should cut NHS funding are a community. Now, at any one time, we all belong to many of these different types of communities. So, of course, we argue round and round in circles between our own communities and between different communities. Of course, we need to argue, but the issue is, no matter how much we argue, we can never know with certainty the right thing to do or to think. Now, in this pursuit of certainty, I've often found myself blinded by bad thinking. I see it when I'm caught in debates with friends at the pub, or when I'm in my classes. I will leap blindly to conclusions without gathering enough evidence. I will consider facts to be true simply because I want them to be, or I'll reject opinions simply because they're different to my own. And I know I'm not alone in this. Often we don't realize the hypocrisies in our own reasoning. With all the advances human beings have made, the wealth of accessible knowledge in our 21st century makes it really quite hard to exist, let alone coexist. Whether it's knowing too much or not enough, whether the truth hurts or our ignorance is not bliss, our minds are not geared up for all of the information out there, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting because when we think we've figured it out, somebody comes along and tells us that we're wrong. We think we're doing the right thing, only to discover we're far from it. Or we acknowledge that we are so small in comparison to the wider world that it might seem futile to use our knowledge for anything other than personal gain. It's demoralizing. And for quite a big portion of my life, I've kind of struggled to cope with it all. But all is not hopeless. As I've been battling with knowledge, as I've been wading through the mess that is understanding, I've discovered a bunch of ways to help me accept that I can't know everything. It's a sort of idiot's guide to being an idiot, if you will. And I'd like to share it in the hope that there are some idiots among you, no offense, who would like to join me in my quest in accepting that I know nothing, and in knowing that I know nothing, and talking to people from other communities who also get that we know nothing. We might be able to strike aside our differences and actually, genuinely learn something. But before we dive into the guide to accepting that I know that I don't know anything at all, which is a working title, we must take a quick detour into the murky waters of epistemology. Now, epistemology is a big word, and I had to use Google to discover that it basically means the study of knowledge, of how we know what we know. And in my very basic and primitive understanding of epistemology, it comes down to there being 4 main ways that we can know things. Now, the first is through experience or observation. So this is where we use our senses or tools that can improve our senses to learn about the world around us. So, for example, I might look at my skin through a microscope and discover that there are cells inside skin. And the second way of knowing is through listening to or reading the knowledge of others. So again, kind of simple. Somebody else looks through the microscope and then writes a really patronizing GCSE biology textbook, and I can learn all about cells in skin. Now, the third way of knowing is reason or logic. So this is where we can take what we've learnt from our experiments, our observations, and from books, apply our own thoughts, and come up with new deductions or theories. So I might learn that there are cells inside skin and think, perhaps there are cells inside all organic matter. But this would obviously be a theory, which I would require more proof before I could fully accept. Now, the fourth way of knowing, and one that is slightly separate from the previous three, is divine intervention. Now, this is the idea that knowledge can be passed to us directly by a higher being through a holy text or an epiphany or a vision. Nowadays, though, this fourth method is somewhat frowned upon by more sciencey types, as they consider it more illogical, as it can't be quite so easily measured. But before we get caught up in the whole science versus religion debate, let's just sweep it under the lovely red carpet. My hope is that we can avoid this sort of circular debate somehow. At this point, though, it might seem like I'm making mountains out of molehills. I've said I'm obsessed by knowing things. I went onto Google, I discovered 4 ways I can know things, so why don't I just do it? Read some books, do some experiments, get my answers. Well, yeah, it's not that easy. All of these methods of knowing are imperfect. They're flawed. First of all, how can I completely, 100% trust my senses? What proof do I have that what I see, taste, smell, touch, and feel here are real and true? It doesn't take much to fool a human's senses. How often do we see things that aren't there or hear things that haven't made a sound? And if I can't trust my senses all of the time, I do have to slightly mistrust everything that they tell me. And if I can't trust my own senses, how can I trust what other people tell me? Because they're only using their senses, and they might be lying or they might be wrong. And if I can't trust my senses and I can't trust what people tell me, then how can I trust the things that I think about what I've heard and what I've seen and all of those, and all of a sudden, it seems all 4 methods are somewhat immeasurable. But this is really hard for me to wrap my head around. Basically, I don't know anything. Everything that I think I know, I have to be aware of the fact that I might actually be wrong. I don't like that. Remember how I said I'm obsessed by knowing things, and here I am trying to accept that I can't know anything? Hence the guide. The sort of steps I try and take whenever I'm presented with a new piece of information or a new thought or a new fact. It's a far from perfect guide, it's far from complete, and it's probably a little bit silly, but it's what I try and use. And I have drawn some pictures to help me explain it, but I'm a terrible artist, so bear with me. Now, the first thing I do whenever I have new information or I'm trying to work something out is I gather the evidence. Now, it might seem quite simple, but obviously it's also very important. The more evidence I have, the more I can trust it. And yes, that is a stick version of me with a telescope and some books. Now, the second thing I do while I'm gathering the evidence is I question the evidence. I never trust it 100%. I interrogate it vigorously and I try to find flaws in it. And I try not to be afraid to find evidence that disagrees with what I already believe. And while I'm not trusting any evidence, I also trust no one. You see, human beings lie, and I do too. My memory, a human's memory, is a fickle being that will trip me up just as easily as my pesky senses. That's my brain tripping me up. Now, while I'm not trusting anyone and I'm not trusting my evidence, there is something I do. And that's not be afraid to be annoyingly inquisitive and curious. I be the why kid. Now, nobody wants to be the why kid, but if I keep asking why and why and why until I can't ask why anymore, it helps me get to the bottom of whether the facts and the evidence are lying to me. But while I'm saying why, there's something I don't say, and that's never. I have to remind myself that I can't just reject a fact as never possible simply because it disagrees with what I already think, even if that makes me a little bit angry, which conveniently is the next step. Don't get angry. With all of the conflicting viewpoints floating around out there and all of the bad thinking that comes with them, it is very easy to get angry, and believe me, I do. But I've realized it's futile. There's no good thinking happening when the red mist descends. Anger just blinds us. So instead, I try to be positive with that anger, and I try to turn it into passion. And yes, that is a passion fruit. The idea is, if I can turn that anger into passion, then I will make more sense. I can't just yell and attack someone who I think is wrong. Anger gets us nowhere. When an opinion is thrown at us aggressively, we just put up defenses. Nobody wants to listen to an angry person, but the passionate person, well, we know they're speaking with patience because they're trying to get it right, even if that means accepting that they're wrong. And the final thing I do is be reasonable. Just be reasonable, in fairness and in logic. Am I asking the right questions? Am I giving all the points of view equal, considered, unbiased thought? Just be reasonable. And that's kind of it. My guide to accepting that I know that I don't know anything at all. Like I said, it's kind of silly, it's probably far from complete, and it definitely needs better pictures. But in doing these things, in gathering evidence, in keeping calm, in trying to ask why, I found I argue less and I learn a lot more. Throughout my 18 years of being a student, I've become quite miffed, shall we say, that often our idea of learning is one person who knows standing up and telling a group of people facts they must write down, remember, and regurgitate on a piece of paper. And of course, I understand the need to test and exam and to grade, but it isn't the only way to learn, nor is it even the best way. But that's an argument that has been made many times before me. For various uninteresting reasons, I've been to 8 different educational institutions in my 18 years as a student. That's schools, colleges, and universities. Now, the average number for someone my age is more like 3 or 4. So I've seen an above-average number of different communities of learners all trying to learn. And it's been through these different communities that I've learned the most. I love to learn by talking to people who have different opinions and thoughts and different communities of thought to my own, but I can't do it if I already think I know it all. I have to ask them questions. I have to let them ask me questions and let my questions dance with their questions and not get angry, not reject different opinions, and above all, remember that none of us have the answers. That's possibly the one thing I'll say with moderate certainty that I know. No one has the answers. No one's figured it out. And anyone who says they do, well, they're either lying or they're completely bonkers. It's been through different communities that I've learnt the most. In our modern age, there is so much information readily available at our literal fingertips. Because yes, maybe we do know some things, but we've never learnt it through bad thinking. We've learnt through questions. We've learnt through questionings and questioning people from different communities. And so, question what you know. Question what you read and see and hear. Question what people tell you, and question what I'm telling you right now. And, of course, question yourself. There is a certain pleasure in discovering that you're wrong. It means you get to learn something else out, and the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn, and the more satisfaction that little bit of my head gets. Now, my entire guide and argument can be summed up quite nicely in the words of Shakespeare. A fool thinks himself to be wise, but a wise man knows himself to be a fool. And I think those are pretty good words to live by. But then again, I could be wrong. Thank you.